itself. If you are calling in and don't have access to Menti, that is no problem. What you can do if you're a Rhoda member or a fisherman where you've reached out to Rhoda, you actually have a Rhoda number that you can actually text questions to. And then Annie or Lane can actually enter those questions right into Menti for you. Or if you have other folks' phone numbers that you're using as well, that's fine too. Any of the planning team can do that as well. So don't hesitate to text those questions to Rhoda or to somebody you know on the planning team, and they can enter those into Menti if that's possible. So what I think we want to do now is, and again, we're going to try to make sure all these questions are somehow get to our panelists for the breakout sessions as best we can. And we continue to really look forward to the breakout sessions being much more interactive and more time to really dig into some of these issues, which are rich and complicated. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Brian, if he's with us, to kick off the next panel, which is about physical habitat modification.
All right, thanks, Pat. Back here again for this one and the next session. This one, also under the topic of ecosystem effects, it's a little bit different than some of the ways the other ones are set up in that we're actually looking at some specific stressors that may interact with the marine environment. Specifically, we'll be looking at EMF and acoustics, or acoustics EMF, as the slides will go. On our panel today, we have Andrew Gale, who you just heard giving that excellent keynote address with the Center for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture in the UK. We also have Zoe Hutchinson, who I think we stole from the UK, is now at URI's Graduate School of Oceanography. And has been, instrumental in some of our original work in the U.S. with EMF in regards to lobsters and skates on the Atlantic coast. And lastly, we have Erica Stotterman, who is a bioacoustician within BOEM's Office of Environmental Programs. Erica's acoustics expertise is understanding how animals use sound in the marine environment, and not only in communication, but masking from anthropogenic sources as well. So with that, I kind of wanted to give Andrew like a little, intro to why do we care about this topic.
Is my audio on?
Yes.
Okay, yes. Hello, everyone, again, and thanks for sticking with us. There's already some really good, interesting stuff come out. So, yeah, why are we interested in this? This links into the so what question. So we're all traveling on a helicopter, and we know that these things are creating energy. But what happens is they're not only creating energy for us to use in terms of, flicking the switch and putting the kettle on, but they also create energy in the physical environment. And this is what we're looking at here. It's unusual topics that as humans we don't really think about that much, particularly is underwater sound, electromagnetic fields, and to a lesser degree is heat coming from the power generation. But these things do occur, and they are found in the environment, and there are many organisms that actually can respond to them and may be sensitive to them. And what we don't know is whether these are actual stresses that are going to cause a problem, or whether they just get a response, but actually there is no problem at the end. That's what we're trying to get to. And if you're still wondering, so what? These are things that don't affect humans. Well, actually, certainly in Europe, in law, you have to take these into account in your environmental assessments. There is in terms of ecosystem change, the legislation requires assessment of energy emissions. So these things all require to be put into the assessments. So in some ways, whether we like it or not, we do have to consider them. And it's about understanding them, and the physics is a key element to that.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. We'll move it on to Erica now to talk about sound and vibration. Erica, I might need some, do I need to turn some, oh, there we go. Do we hit play?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
Wait for me to tell you. Okay,
all right.
So hi everybody, thanks for having me here. Before we get into potential effects of sound, we really just need to go through a few basics about what a sound wave really is. So we can sort of think of it as two things. It's a sound wave with areas of high and low pressure where the particles are compressed or spread apart. And then it's also the tiny back and forth movement of those particles, whether that's solid, liquid, or gas, as this pressure wave moves through the medium. So in a moment, Brian's going to press the button, but I want you to keep your eye on one of these little blue dots, and you'll notice that it moves back and forth. There's no actual net movement of particles outward, but there is a net movement of the pressure wave. One more time, Brian. Okay, so hopefully you guys could see that. You can go to the next slide, please. Oh, that animation makes it go. Okay, that's fine. It's going to go twice. You've seen it plenty. All right. So that's the first animation. This next one really focuses more on this element of particle motion, which is really important because it's one of the primary ways that fish and invertebrates detect sound. So we really need to dig into this a little bit more. So imagine again, we have a speaker or some sound source. It could be a pile being driven into the earth in the center here. You can click it, please, Brian. As that vibrates, it displaces the water particles immediately adjacent to it. So it creates particle motion right there at the source. Click it again, please. It also generates this propagating sound wave, which moves outward. One more time. And one more time. So as this pressure wave moves out throughout the medium, throughout the water, whatever it may be, it also displaces those particles back and forth. So there's that net movement back and forth. So click one more time, Brian. So there's particle motion that's due to the displacement of the source itself that's very close to the source. And then one more time. There's also particle motion associated with the pressure wave as it passes through the medium. So this is just important to keep in mind as we're thinking about how animals perceive sound. Okay, next slide, please. So what we know that particle motion diminishes rapidly from the source, and this little diagram on the bottom right shows that relationship. So it drops off really quickly, which means it's a much stronger cue close to the source. Pressure, on the other hand, propagates much further away. And actually, once you get far enough away from the sound source, those two quantities decrease linearly in a very clear relationship. We know that impulsive sounds from pile driving become less impulsive with distance. That's because of the multipass, how the sound bounces on the surface and the water bottom. So the sound sort of smears out over time. We also know that some of the acoustic energy propagates through the sediment and then re-radiates out into the water column. So usually the sound levels measured closer to the bottom are higher than at the surface. And we also know that bubble curtains are effective at reducing acoustic pressure. Click, please. Now, what do we not know or need to know? So we don't really understand how rapidly particle motion diminishes from the source, and that's because it's very difficult to get measurements of particle motion close to pile driving activities. We also don't know exactly how these impulsive sounds become non-impulsive, what distance that happens. And that's important because impulsive sounds tend to be more damaging to certain animals than non-impulsive sounds. We don't quite understand how much acoustic energy travels through the substrate and re-radiates out into the water. And we don't really understand how well various noise abatement technologies reduce particle motion or substrate vibration. We know how they work for pressure. Okay, next slide, please. So now thinking about the animals. So some animals can detect particle motion, some can detect pressure, and some can detect both. So for humans, the best way to think about this is if you're at a concert, a really loud one, and you're near the speaker, your ears are going to hear the pressure wave. And if you're close enough, your little arm hairs might vibrate back and forth, and that's the particle motion component of the wave that you're detecting. And then finally, your feet may feel the substrate vibration. And the best way we can relate to that, I like this little video on the bottom left from Jurassic Park, the classic scene where the T-Rex is approaching the vehicle and the vibration from the animal's feet is going through the earth and then through the car and then through the cup of water, and that's how they know it's nearby. So that's substrate vibration. Next, please. Okay, so in terms of hearing in fish and invertebrates, it's really a spectrum. There's a range of sensitivities. So at the top of the screen here in the blue, we can think of these animals as having a more narrow or less sensitive capability of hearing. And then towards the bottom, a wider frequency range, they can detect a broader range of frequencies and they're more sensitive. So animals that have no air-filled cavity, meaning no swim bladder or, no swim bladder at all, they're limited to only detecting particle motion. So this is the sharks, skates, sculpin, and most invertebrates. Click, please. Then moving along, we have some animals that do have a swim bladder, but it's just a basic normal swim bladder. There's nothing special about it. They have slightly more sensitive hearing, but still pretty much limited to particle motion. Next, please. Then we move on to species like cod, menhaden, weakfish, and drum. These animals do have some specializations of the swim bladder, which means that there are certain components that bring the swim bladder in closer proximity to the ear, and this allows them to be more sensitive. And then finally, last click. So these animals, the ones that have a bony connection between the swim bladder and the ear, it means that there's a coupling inside their head, and that allows them to detect both particle motion and pressure. So some examples of that are carp, catfish, and herring. So again, you can see that there's a spectrum of hearing capabilities. All fishes can detect particle motion. All invertebrates, as far as we know, can detect particle motion, but only some can also detect pressure. Okay, next slide. So what does this mean? Animals that detect particle motion may only be affected by sounds very close to the source. So remember that diagram a couple slides ago where you see particle motion drops off really rapidly as you move away from a sound source. So if you can only detect particle motion, you're really only going to be affected by that very close by. Whereas animals that can detect acoustic pressure could be affected over much greater distances. We also know that operational noise from offshore wind is generally below a lot of animals' hearing thresholds. It's pretty quiet. It generally blends into ambient or background noise in the ocean. However, there's a caveat here, which is that we really do need more data on hearing capabilities in many species of fish and invertebrates. Okay, and then what we need to know, like I just said, basic hearing thresholds for many species. We also don't know how benthic and burrowing organisms are affected by substrate vibration from pile driving or from operational noise. This really hasn't been studied much at all. And we know that there's definitely some substrate vibration happening when those piles are driven in. And then finally, potential masking effects from vessel noise, operational noise, or others. We know that fish do communicate acoustically, and they may be affected when they can't hear one another or communicate effectively, but we really don't know the extent of the effects. Okay, and that's it for me. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Erica. That was great. So next, Zoe, talk about EMF.
Hi, thank you, Brian. Okay, so I just start with an introduction to what an electromagnetic field is and how that comes into the marine environment from a subsea cable. So focusing on the diagram, this is a diagram of a DC current. So you can see that the voltage is applied through the center of the cable and the electric field is contained within the cable sheathing. Whereas in the bottom there, you can see that the magnetic field is actually emitted out into the environment. And that environment can be the seabed or it could be in the water column. And so if a fish or a water body is to move through the magnetic field, then that gives rise to a motionally induced electric field. And so that way you have a magnetic and an electric field component from a subsea cable. In addition to that, if you have an AC current, then that has a rotational nature to it, and that also gives rise to an induced electric field. And so really what we want to know is how that interacts with the natural electromagnetic environment as it's presented to the species of interest. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we know, at the moment, what we know is that the electromagnetic fields from subsea cables are generally modelled and much less frequently measured, although there have been some studies that have taken in situ measurements. We know from the physics that the electromagnetic fields reduce with the distance from the source. So the closer that you are to a cable, the more higher intensity of EMF that you'll be exposed to. And if you're further away from a cable, then you'll be exposed to a lower intensity EMF. And the factors that influence the electromagnetic field that's emitted come from the cable properties, such as whether the cable is AC or DC, but also the configuration of the cables within the cable. The components within the cable, and also the properties of the shielding. In addition to that, the power that goes through the cable will influence the intensity of the electromagnetic field. And so it's not just the maximum capacity of the cable that's important, but also the power that's being transmitted at any one time. And we know that the electromagnetic field, as it's presented from a subsea cable, interacts with the local natural electromagnetic environment. And so we have to understand it within the context of the local area. The electromagnetic field is a spatial temporally variable component, and so over space and time it will vary, and that's where we have to focus our understanding. So at the moment there's no electromagnetic field threshold that we have to adhere to, so we don't have any kind of cut-off marks at the moment. So moving on to what we need to know, or what we would like to know. Thanks. So with the regard to the cable characteristics, as I said, the cable type is important, but also the components within it and the different types of cable materials. There are lots of different types of cables around, and I think a greater understanding as to what they present in terms of what cables are being used, but also how they operate. And that's very much in terms of the energy that passes through them in relation to an offshore wind farm. And that could be in relation to the inter-array cables or the export cables. And then it would be quite beneficial if we could have an improved ability to predict the electromagnetic fields. And in order to do that, it would be useful to truth models with actual empirical measurements. Modeling tends to tell us about the scenario that we inform the model to tell us about, whereas empirical measurements allow us to identify other factors that we maybe don't know to include in the models. So a dual approach there would be really useful going forward. A longer term data set would be beneficial in terms of understanding the temporal variability over the course of a daily variation or perhaps a seasonal variation as it relates to the power that's being produced by an offshore wind farm. And in terms of the spatial variability, we're not just talking about the distance from the cable, but also the variation in the electromagnetic field along the length of a cable. And we know that export cables can pass through many ecosystems, which may be important to the species of interest. So it would be really useful if we were to able to model and measure and also share the data that we find from these different things. And ultimately what we need to focus on is trying to understand the interaction with the natural electromagnetic field environment. And to help explain that, if I draw your attention to the top right hand side, the cube there is a demonstration of an AC cable in a seabed. And so the black lines that go across the cube, that's the geomagnetic field. The cable that's demonstrated there is AC, so you see that the blue lines are indicating the magnetic field that's being emitted from the cable, and the red circular components are the induced electric fields arising from the cable. And then over and above that, you have the bioelectric fields that come from the animals. So you have a crab on the right-hand side and a skate on the left-hand side. And the skate's about to move through the EMF from the cable. So you can see how the electromagnetic environment that an animal is exposed to is quite a complex scenario, and how these things interact is what's really important. So kind of focus quite a lot on understanding EMF, that's the perceived pressure. And as much as we have to understand the electromagnetic field and the characteristics that influence that, we also have to improve our knowledge base of the receptor. So in the diagram at the bottom, we put the receptor at the center of the scenario, and we have to take the vantage point of the receptor species that we're interested in. And what I mean by that is trying to improve the knowledge base in terms of how the animals are able to detect the electromagnetic field. So that's whether they're magnetoreceptive or electroreceptive or perhaps both, and what sensitivity ranges it is that they're actually receptive to. In addition to that, we have to layer that information with knowledge of how that varies through a life cycle for each of the species we're interested in. And in addition to that, we have to understand the movement ecology for the species and how that means that they'll interact with an electromagnetic field from a cable. And importantly, the encounter rate. How quickly or how often will they encounter a cable, and what kind of influence does that have? And then so the last thing that I was asked to talk about, if we move on to the next slide, please, was the thermal radiation that might come from a cable. So we do know that heat may be emitted from an operational cable. During our EMF study, we did attach some thermometers to our EMF sledge and tried to measure the heat signature, but we didn't detect anything. But it's not really something that's well studied. We don't have a lot of data to support that. So it would be really useful to identify what the heat signature actually is, particularly with different cable powers and how that increases. In order to assess the relevance to the species, we also really need to understand the spatial scale of the heat emitted. If I just draw your attention to that last diagram there, then that is a portrayal of how some of the benthic cables will be introduced into the environment, where they can either be buried or on the seabed. And it's the proximity to the cable that will influence the exposure to the EMF, and most likely also the exposure to the spatial, the heat signature from a cable, if that's detectable to the species. And I think that's it for me. Thank you, Brian.
Great, thank you, Zoe and Erica and Andrew. Maybe Zoe, we have about a minute left in our just for the panel before we have to go to questions. I didn't know if you want to talk about some of the results of what you've observed in Long Island Sound, and that you brought up a very good point about the model matching the empirical data. Maybe you could just touch on what you might know on maybe just those two issues.
Sure. We did find that the modelling that we did was accurate with the components that we asked it to model. But when we did the measurements, we actually found it was high voltage direct current cables that we were measuring. We also measured an AC field, which was unexpected. We are still looking into that. We have done some additional in situ measurements of the cross sound cable, and we're trying to identify if that AC field is associated with the transmission, transference between AC and DC. But yeah, so that's where I was coming from with regard to the model can only model what we ask it to, and if there's things that we don't understand that need to be incorporated into that, that's where we really need empirical measurements to be able to make sure that our models are accurate to real life situations and they're contextual for the species that are exposed to them.
Great, and the last one was maybe some of the observations with lobsters and skates.
Sure. Of course, I haven't really covered the animals. So when we studied, I was asked to focus on the
yes,
physics.
no, I did. This is my this is we are you're right. The panel was and then there's the time. Yeah. So I just for maybe the audience's sake, yeah, we're asked to present on just the stressor. There's effects with the fish in a later panel discussion. But I thought since we had a little bit of extra time there, I'd circle back on the lobster's case. So maybe just very briefly, I don't know, a high level overview of some observations.
Sorry for ruining the time there. Yes, the mesocosm studies that we did, and that was in relation to the cross sound cable, we found that there was quite a subtle response in the lobsters, but there was a response, and we have pushed that over to, or we've interpreted that as an increase in exploration behaviour. And the skates that we exposed to the electromagnetic field had a much stronger response, which is essentially what you would expect perhaps because they are known electroreceptive species. But we found that they travelled an awful lot further when they were exposed to the cable. And even though they travelled further, they were doing it at a much slower speed, and they exhibited a much larger proportion of large terns, which would suggest that they were foraging. So an increase in exploratory behaviour and foraging behaviour, particularly in the electroreceptive skates, but also in the lobsters that we studied as well.
Thank you.
Great, thank you for that on the fly work. So yeah, Pat, back to you for questions.
Slides up for 1 minute. First, sorry, there was a question from a few folks about, is there a difference between electric fields and magnetic fields, or is it all kind of electromagnetic together? Are we really only worried about magnetic fields when it comes to cable? People wanted some clarity on that.
Okay, so we talk about electromagnetic fields because when you're thinking of a cable, there is an electric and a magnetic component. When you're talking about a receptive species, sometimes it's useful to separate the components, and quite often in aquarium studies determining exposure to these things, you quite often have an exposure to a magnetic field. So in that context, it's good to separate them. But in a real life situation, if we go back to the original, the first slide that I looked at, Brian, then that really helps portray that even though it's the magnetic field that's emitted from the cable, there's an induced electric field associated with it. So with an AC field, the induced electric field and the magnetic field occur together. But even with a DC field, with a DC cable, where you only have the magnetic field emitted from the cable, there's still a motionally induced electric field in a marine environment. And so you always have that dual component in a marine environment in the real context of what the animal would be experiencing.
Right, thank you, that's very helpful. And Erica, can we go back to your slide that showed kind of a spectrum of impact or effect on species? Yeah, there. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to if you know where scallops, clams, and squid might fall within kind of the spectrum, at least generally?
Sure, yep, they're going to be at the top. So they're sensitive to particle motion only. which could mean vibrations through the substrate. I guess I should clarify, it's not just water particle motion, but it's also substrate vibration that's all sort of subsumed in that first category there.
Okay, great. Thank you. So there's a question that's got a lot of kind of thumbs up is, what research is there regarding which of these factors, sound, EMF, thermal, is more important, or at least to which species, and it might be affected by others? I mean, do we have some research to tell us kind of where to focus our worries, or not at this point?
I could start and then Zoe could jump in. I guess, all right, so I think the biggest concern for fish that detect pressure is sound, because they can detect sound from a greater distance, so they might experience greater effects from masking, from either pile driving or other noises. They could even experience some acute effects if they're really close to the source where their hearing could be damaged. But fish and invertebrates that are only detecting particle motion, you have to be really, really close to really experience serious effects. Now that said, for sharks do not detect acoustic pressure. So they're only sensitive to particle motion, which means they don't really hear all that well. But as Zoe just alluded to, they are sensitive to some other cues in the environment. So if you're focused on sharks, you might want to think more about the magnetic cues than acoustics. I'll kick it to Zoe and then you can kick it back to me if you think we need more.
Sure. I think it's difficult with the EMF side of things because we don't necessarily know exactly which species are magnetoreceptive or electroreceptive. Some of the time, like for example, with our lobster study, we weren't sure if a lobster was really magnetoreceptive or not, but we knew from a related species that it was a possibility. And so being able to identify whether a species is magnetoreceptive or electroreceptive is a good first step. And quite often, depending on which species you're looking at, there's quite a bit of crossover as well. So in terms of trying to identify some of the effects, the elasmobranchs are one of the better studied taxa. And so coupling information or experiments with that kind of species will help you understand if you're detecting effects, if they are as well. But I'll probably pass over to Andrew and see if he would like to add to either of what Erica or I said.
You both answered the question very well. The only thing I would say is that sometimes I think we're asking the question slightly incorrectly, because we look at these, we assume they're stressors, we're looking for where they're going to cause a problem. Now, absolutely a loud sound will affect, a sensitive species, as a large EMF might as well. But what we're trying to understand is at the levels that we see at the moment, and for the organisms that we've got some information on, is does it change things which could have a meaningful impact on them, right? So not that their ears are going to burst or that their brains are going to come flying out because they're exposed to some EMF, but actually, does it change their distribution? Zoe talked about the lobsters and the skates. If they're spending more time feeding, and ecologically, are they trying to feed on something that they're not going to get any return from? It's very similar to the arguments that people use for birds and bird avoidance of wind farms. And people are worried about the impact on bird populations because they're flying migratory routes and they're using up lots of energy. So it's setting the question right to then say, right, do we have an animal that can respond? This is where understanding the sensitivities is really good. And then, okay, this is where we need to have a discussion. At what point would we be thinking that there's some meaningful change? So i.e., do they disappear from an area for the next 2 years? Then yes, that could be fairly meaningful. If they just avoid it for a couple of hours, maybe not. If they're attracted to it for a few minutes. So it's getting that context, I think, is important to set this information that we've got about effects that we know occur in order for us to come to those conclusions.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know, Pat, can I jump onto that a little bit, just very, very briefly? I think Andrew brought up, some very good points, and from a sound acoustic point, there is thresholds. We didn't talk about, we didn't have thresholds for EMF, and the focus is on acute noise from like pile driving, which is observed, and there's mitigation in place to reduce that. So so the question is there a need to study that further if we're already mitigating it at the point that we know there is an effect, even if we don't know that effect completely. it is already being mitigated versus something that may be more chronic, with with EMF, where it's there for the life of the project. Anyway, I'm just throwing it out there, and I think that's kind of the feedback that we're trying to get in the prioritization aspect of this workshop.
Another question, which is, has there been studies on any kind of impacts on larval stages of fish or shellfish, which may be particularly sensitive, for instance?
Eric, I think that's to you, right?
Sure.
At least for noise.
I don't think there has been for pile driving, but for other things like seismic air guns, for example, there have been some early studies on fish eggs and larvae, and there was actually very little effect even at very close distances. And a lot of fish have pretty rudimentary hearing when they're that small, and it develops better over time as they grow more hair cells in their ears. So I guess the short answer is I don't think there's been a lot of studies directly related to offshore wind, but from other things we can probably extrapolate that the effect would probably be pretty small. And also keep in mind, for fish eggs and larvae, the mortality rate is very high naturally. So even if, a huge clump of fish eggs was really close to one of these sound sources, on the broad scale of the population level, it's probably going to be pretty minimal.
Andrew, you had your hand up.
Yeah, the last point's fantastic, but I was just going to say that if Stephen was online, he'd be saying that they have done some study. I think it was sea bass larvae, operational wind turbine in Belgium, and again they didn't see anything major. They saw some minor effects, but nothing major. But it's that mortality thing. It's the so what. If we've got 99% mortality in the species anyway, are we adding to that? Then that's what we're trying to understand. There are other things that's going to create mortality. So that's a really important point that Erica just made.
And do we know, there's several folks have emphasized, if we just know a depth at which cables can be buried so that there's just no EMF impact, except for potentially those that actually bury next to it in terms of, say, clams. If we just know a depth, can we just do that, and then we don't actually have to worry about the potential impacts because they don't exist?
I don't know.
Induced electric fields versus actual direct fields. Zoe, I think that's in that context, isn't it?
Okay, so I just want to go back to something that I tried to iterate through the presentation, is that it's not the burial depth that's important, it's the distance from source. So burying a cable doesn't necessarily dampen the field, although it might increase the distance from source. So that's one point. The other point is that although the burial depth does increase the distance from source, and therefore the animals at the seabed might be exposed to a lower intensity, what we don't know is whether or not that's a more biologically relevant intensity. So what we might be doing is reducing the intensity of the EMF such that it brings it into the perceivable EMF range to the receptive species. And so it's not necessarily a translation of we'll bury it deeper, we'll reduce the intensity, and therefore there's less effect or impact. We don't know that. And I think Andrew wants to add to
that. Just very, very quickly, because we did some work on a cable, and we estimated that to get it to under background, if we think that the animal can't detect it, although that's been debated at the moment, but to get it under background for a standard inter-array cable, you have to bury it 11 meters. There is no engineer on the planet who's going to bury a cable 11 meters underground.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. While we're on the thermal radiation side, I think that's one of the big limiting factors of how deep it can go, because you don't want to overheat the cables.
Great. And maybe one last question, just because of time. We've got so many other good ones that we won't be able to capture right now. Is in terms of Block Island brine in particular, were there any studies about measuring EMF or looking at that for the Block Island farm in particular? As it's been constructed and up and running?
Zoe, was there a study? I think there was a post-installation work on the BITS cable to see how well the model matched, right? I don't think it was BOEM funded, but
I think it was CRMC. I believe it was a requirement of the post-installation surveys. I know that Peter Sigri was involved with John King to take the measurements at Block Island, and they focused on the export cable, had a little bit more difficulty measuring the inter-array cables. I can't comment on the levels. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but they did do some surveys, and I believe the report is not released for public viewing yet, but it should be soon.
Thanks, Zoe.
Okay, I'm aware of the time, so we are going to move on and the like. Just a few things to know about,